All right, hello and welcome to another panel discussion. Today's topic is sales conversation secrets. My name is John Golden from Pipeliner CRM and SalesPOP Sales Magazine. And today I'm joined by three great experts in the area of sales conversations. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background as to who we are. Just make sure everybody can see my screen okay? Yep. Jermaine, Nancy, you can see my screen?
Yep.
All good,
great.
thanks, yeah.
Okay. All right, perfect. Okay, sales conversation secrets, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And as I said, this is brought to you by SalesPOP Sales Magazine. So if you haven't checked this out, please do. That's salespop.pipelinersales.com, where you will get the latest and greatest in sales insights and expertise from a range of people. We've got great contributors, and the folks on our panel today are also contributors as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. Check that out. Also brought to you by Pipeliner CRM, the world's most visual CRM. So again, if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I would encourage you to do so. All right, well, let's start with having our panelists actually introduce themselves today. So I'm going to start off with Nancy. Nancy, if you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity, John. I'm Nancy Blakey. I'm the president and founder of Sales Pro Insider, and my passion is to help people have better conversations in sales, customer service, and leadership. And we work with companies around the globe to help them hire better, increase the skill sets to have the better conversations, and make sure that their systems and strategies support those efforts.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jermaine, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Jermaine Edwards. I'm the Londoner here. And I'm the director of a company called the Key Account Hack. And essentially, I help key account managers, sales leaders, organizations become irreplaceable advisors to their customers. So we speak to really a lot of organizations in the B2B space and help them to really create plans that drive sales and deepen client relationships.
Okay, and great. And we have joining us now is also Anne Hawkins. Anne, if you want to introduce yourself. I think Anne's still getting into the system here, so I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. But while we're waiting, what I would like to do is just do a quick poll. Okay, this helps us in figuring out who we have on the call, what type of people we have on. So let's just do that quickly. I'm going to launch this poll, and it's going to ask you what your role is. Okay, so just for a couple of minutes, if everybody who's on the call, if you could just click and let us know who you are and what kind of role you fulfill.
Exciting. We should have some music playing and
we should
get the energy going here.
Yeah, well, you could sing, Nancy.
No, you don't. No, you don't want that.
Okay, we just want a couple more seconds. We nearly have everybody answering the question. Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close the poll, and we'll be able to see who we have. Okay, so let me close that. Let me share the results with everybody. Okay, so we have 40% or over 40% sales leader, salespeople, some executives, and others. Okay, so it's a nice mix of people. All right, perfect. All right, well, let's get into the actual conversation itself today. And again,
conversation about conversation.
Conversation about conversation. Exactly.
Love that.
Just making sure that everybody again can see my screen. Yeah,
yes.
Jermaine. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's start off with our first question. And this is, I really want you to define a sales conversation because, there's a difference between talking to a prospect and having a sales conversation, right? So, yeah, maybe Nancy, if you want to kick this off and give us a definition of what you would consider a sales conversation as opposed to just talking.
Well, and I call it not just talking. It's a pitch. We can, lots of people go in and they're ready to talk to people and pitch at them, and that prospect or buyer has an option if they're being pitched at. They can duck, they can bat it away, or they could accept it. And so, by having a conversation, we reduce that the choices, because a conversation is a two-way flow of information. And to make it a sales conversation that's productive, it's focused on what's in it for the buyer and ends with a clear commitment to action or decision for the next steps, which makes it productive for both parties in the conversation.
Okay, and how about you, Jermaine? How would you define this?
Well, I like what Nancy's kind of put forward. I'd only add, I think I'd be a little more kind of brief and just say, for me, sales conversation begins at the place of mutualities. It's a mutually understood, transparent, and value-led conversation that leads to a yes or a no. And we can often think that a sales conversation has to end with a positive call to action, but no can be just as powerful as yes, in my opinion, where it's mutually understood. So the very purpose of any sales conversation for me is to create clients and advocates. So even if someone who says no at this time and you walk away from it, should still be better off having that conversation with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I always think that sometimes we're afraid to get a no, but in fact, a no can be our best friend rather than invest a lot of time. Hi, Anne. We're delighted you could join us. Before you answer this question, maybe just give the audience a little bit of background on who you are.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, I hear you great. Yeah.
Sorry about the delay. So my name is Anne Hawkins, and I'm the MD of a networking organisation called Drive. We called it Drive because we think everyone needs drive to succeed in business. And one of the things that we do is to teach people how to connect with potential customers and how to have a conversation with them. So I'm really looking forward to learning a lot today.
Yeah, and where are you today, Anne?
Well, I'm based near Cambridge in the UK.
Yeah, so today we have 2 English people, an Irish person, and an American. Sounds like a joke, but it's not. Trying to think of a good punchline for that, but I don't have one. So, Anne, how would you define sales conversation?
Just tell us where the bar is.
Yeah, exactly. How would you define a sales conversation as opposed to just talking to a prospect?
Well, as has already been said, I think it's really when you get to the point where you're finding out what it is the prospect needs, what it is that they're really after, and whether you can provide that for them. So it's a very definite thing that you're looking for to see if there is that connection and if there is a purpose in taking the conversation forward.
Mm-hmm. That's perfect. Great. So, okay, maybe start this time with Jermaine. What are some of the best ways of opening a conversation? Because I think this is the part that some people really struggle with. It's like, how do you open a conversation? How do you connect immediately? Or what are some of the techniques that you use?
Well, I think there's kind of no excuse to not know at least one element of personal detail on a potential prospect today or customer. So I always kind of lead with something personal, whether that's from LinkedIn or otherwise. So it could be something really as simple as, hi, this is Jermaine, notice this really specific sales article or particular thing inside their company, and really wanted to share some insights on what we're seeing in your industry that could be a benefit to you in your XY department or role. And so I'd begin with them with some sort of personal detail that leads to an insight that then opens up a conversation for continuing that on a more kind of a mutual level. Yeah,
that's some great advice. And just a quick note to the audience: if you have any questions you have, just put it into the question box. You'll see it there. and we'll either take it at the end, or I'll interject if it's something pertinent to what we're talking about at the particular moment. Anne, how would you open a conversation?
I tend to always look for something that we have in common. So on all of my online profiles, I say that I'm interested in jazz, and people only have to follow me for a few minutes to know what my politics are and what my views on feminism are and all that kind of stuff. So I'd always look for something that I have in common with someone and start the conversation with that. And then once you've got that rapport going, you can go into what they need and what they're really looking for.
Yeah. Excellent. And how about you, Nancy? How would you advise opening a conversation? How do you do it?
When we help people open or have their conversations, you're right when you said it's one of the most difficult parts for people is how to get started. And so we give a framework for every part of the conversation that people can make their own. And building off of what Jermaine said, we need to greet the person, then we need to explain why we're in contact with them, which can include something that we've researched on them or that piece of insight, and really centers why should they talk with us. And then we can ask a question to engage them and get them talking as soon as possible. And it needs to be said, I think, that it's all centered on our preparation. Both Anne and Jermaine mentioned that part too, that we need to know something, but that, the start of a conversation is more productive when we're prepared and we've broken our own preoccupation to get there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Absolutely. So you get the conversation started, whether you're well prepared, maybe you know something about them, maybe you have something in common. So you break the ice. That's all good. That's just a first step. So how can you then engage the prospect and get them to actually open up and start sharing with you? Jermaine, do you want to open with this one?
Yeah, I think just going back, I think you have to be clear with your intent right at the beginning and begin with them in mind. So once you've opened up and you've led with insight, it should then be fairly self-explanatory from where you go there. So the next question has to be about their opinion around whatever that specific insight is. So that could be something as simple as, what are your views on this particular area? How have you found this particular X legislation impact your specific business today? And what has been your response? I mean, it could be really something as simple as that. But to begin with, it should be about getting them speaking as fast as possible, and opinion-based questions can do that really powerfully.
And how about you, Nancy? How would you get them to open up and start sharing?
Well, I think it's what Jermaine said, and it's an extension of once we've set the context and the expectation for where the conversation's going, and we ask something, we have to ask something that's relevant that they can answer. And based on our research, that might be something, opinion, I like that a lot, Jermaine, that, people will give you their opinion most of the time. Some people won't until they trust you. And so the first question we might need to ask might be around confirming time. And there's a big, debate about whether you should ever mention time, because, if they say, no, I don't have the time, where do you go from there? But I think that's one of the first things is we need to get them to agree and earn the right to engage and get them start sharing by asking about, confirming that this time works, or how much time do we expect that this will take. And then the question that we ask them could be something personal, or it could be something very much business-centered, depending on their role, the style of communication that they've presented to us. And so we need to be ready, I think, with a few different questions, so that once we've done our engagement in those first 30 seconds, we know what questions most likely they're going to answer right away.
Absolutely. How about you, Anne? How do you get a prospect to open? And is it different in person than on the phone, say?
Yeah, I think it is very different. I love what Nancy says about the time. I would always ask people, how much time do we have? So not do they have time, but always try and get a really specific time scale. And I think it's different in person because you've got so much more social stuff going on. You know, you're either meeting for a drink or a coffee or this or that. So there's a lot more. Leading into it all, and you've got all the body language stuff going on as well. I think on the phone, you're more likely to get the brush off, and if you don't nail this one very quickly. So I think it is about asking very specific questions. You know, you're really wanting to find what's keeping them up at night. You know, what are they worried about? What is it that you can help them with?
Yeah, so really kind of trying to connect, and which segues nicely into our next question, which is how big a role does empathy play in a good sales conversation? And I've been discussing this a lot with people recently, just the whole issue of empathy, and I still find today that a lot of people still don't really understand what empathy really means, or the fact how important it is. What role do you think, Nancy? Maybe we start with this. What role do you think empathy plays in a good sales conversation?
I think it plays a big role because that is two human beings connecting and having that conversation where both are participating, and the sales rep that's paying attention to where they're going from, where that person is coming from is so important in your follow-up questions and where you're going to take that conversation. But empathy can also backfire, because if we are too empathetic, we might not ask them the tough questions that really get to the root of what's going on and how we can help them, not just in the solution, which is the product or service, but in that value that we're giving along the way in helping them make a decision or get something through in their company. And so, so many people will take the time to talk to you about their situation, but whether they're willing to act on it, is where empathy comes in. And if we're too empathetic and not being the one that's nudging them and maybe even pushing them in some ways to face the reality of their situation, which will help them be willing to make a change if they need to, that's when it can backfire.
Mm-hmm. Anne, what do you think about the role of empathy?
Yeah, I think it's obviously really important, and as Nancy says, there's a difference between feeling it and actually going down the chute with them. So you want to understand what they're feeling, but not necessarily get into it with them, because two good buddies together will put the world to rights, but it won't necessarily solve their immediate problem. So yeah, understanding what they're feeling, but you don't want to get in there and feel it with them. Right.
That's a good point. I also think that there's a point that I always make to people, especially is in B2C, in consumer buying, right? If I go out and buy something today, something for the house or whatever, that's really just my issue, and maybe I'll get into trouble with my wife for buying something stupid or wasting money. But generally speaking, the consequences aren't that great. In B2B, a purchasing decision can be a career enhancing thing, and it can be a career limiting thing if you get it wrong. So I also think that there's often a lot of fear involved that sometimes isn't understood by salespeople. Jermaine, empathy.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Nancy and Anna said. Empathy is huge. I mean, for me, it's just one of the core components that enables you to see and to feel and think more like the other person, so you can build trust. And for me, with any prospect conversation, they're immediately looking for clues that indicate whether or not you're a safe person to be open with. Mm-hmm. And I think when empathy helps you to ask difficult questions, because you can better notice what's concerning to them, and then you can get more specific with the questions you ask. But I understand definitely what Nancy said. You can go sometimes too far down the rabbit hole and with sympathy and kind of play the old boys club, as it were. But it's really important that you use empathy to create a safe environment for the prospect to tell you the truth.
Yeah. Do you think people can learn to be empathetic? Because it doesn't come naturally to everybody, right?
Oh, I believe they definitely can learn empathy, without a doubt. Because, I mean, what's really interesting that I find about kind of any emotion is that it's inherent, or the ability for us to see emotion is fairly evident. We can notice those things. The only difference is, our approach to those specific emotions when we see the other person. So I don't think actually empathy is about necessarily whether or not you have it or not. We all have the ability to empathize or to see other people's emotions. The challenge is what we tend to do with that. And I think sometimes we ignore it with our own agenda. But if you're really customer focused or people focused, then the noticing of the emotions will immediately move you into a place of empathy because you care.
That's good. We have a quick question from someone, maybe Anne, to start with this one, and then Nancy weigh in as well. Just the question was, how do you know, when you say you don't want to go too far, how do you know if you're going too far with empathizing? Anne,
Well, I think yeah, sure. I think if you start to feel the way they're feeling, you lose the ability to help anyone to get out of that particular situation that they're in. As Jermaine said, what you wanted to do is create trust. So by showing someone that you understand how they're feeling, but you still keep that little bit of distance, it lets them know that they can trust you to help them out of that situation, or to really understand what they're going through. As Jermaine said, when someone's in a career-making decision, they really need to know that you understand what they're going through. But if you convey the same kind of fear or uncertainty that they're feeling, that really isn't going to help them. So it's a fine line, but it's a very definite line there, I think.
Right. Nancy, do you have anything to add to that? How do you know if you're going too far?
I have a couple of things to add to the whole empathy discussion. And one of them is that, emotions are definitely a major driver in people's willingness to take action or make a decision on something. But there are some people that they'll never admit that emotions involved. They like to stay at that very logical and analytical level. And so if we come off as being too emotionally connected or talk about the emotions of something, we could ruin trust with them. They could consider that very superficial. So I believe that especially in B2B, we have to be very careful about talking about emotions. And instead, a behavioral psychologist that I worked with many, many years ago, he said it's more about intensity. And there are so many emotions that people will be experiencing in their daily work life. And it's hard to figure out what are the emotions that are going on, how do I need to, work with them. And he said, if you instead you pay attention to the intensity level, the emotional factor is there, but you're not going to get yourself into trouble. So, and how he explained it is intensity, if you look at it as a scale of 1 to 10, how intense somebody is, which you could look at as, their passion towards something, the volume, the pace in which they're speaking, etc. And if you're communicating with them, on a 1 to 10 scale at a 3, but as they're getting into one of the topics that you're discussing, or they're talking about their situation or a problem or a challenge, or maybe something they're actually even excited about, and they're maybe raising their intensity to a 6 or 7, and you remain at a 3,
right,
there starts becoming this big disconnect where they don't, sense that you're in it with them. And so we can adjust intensity with our tone, with our volume, with our pace a lot easier than we can adjust to emotions.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great insight. Thank you. Okay, next we're going to move on to, and this is a bit of a kind of pet like soapbox thing of mine. So we become a very self-obsessed culture. I don't think anybody would argue with that, and one that celebrates instant gratification. And particularly, and this is, I'm going to sound like some old fogey in a second here, but particularly, I mean, if we look at the generations coming through now, they've grown up in this very social, sharing everything, very, in some ways, like everything image conscious, all of that stuff. So, given that that's the pervasive culture that we live in, how do salespeople avoid moving too fast in a conversation, or even more importantly, making it too me centric? So, Anne, maybe you want to kick that one off.
Yeah, sure. As probably the oldest person on the panel, yeah, I come through the whole social media thing. I can remember when it all started and how things have changed a lot, especially in buyer behaviour.
Yeah.
And I think actually that's probably the safeguard, because the buyer now expects to be in charge of this conversation. They're looking for someone who can supply them, rather than someone who can sell to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the checks and balances that come in. And even with the most self-obsessed person, who's used to sharing everything, I think, if they're getting into, if they've done all the things that we've talked about beforehand to set all this up, then once they get to this point, they're going to be looking at the prospect, at the customer, and using the pace, as Nancy said, using the pace for them to satisfy what that person wants. So I think it can be tricky if you're used to doing all that kind of stuff really, really fast, but I do think the checks and balances are there.
Okay. Jermaine, how do you advise and help people, especially salespeople, not either move too fast or become too me-centric in an engagement?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I do believe there's a bit of a tension between what I call kind of commission and conversation, which is, I mean, I've been there myself. Your targets have gone up. You're a few thousand away from target, and you have prospects in your pipeline, and you need to close them because your manager's on your back. And unfortunately, a lot of sales culture right now and management don't actually promote the art of slowing down, thinking, and proper prospect planning. I think it's kind of symptomatic, I should say, of poor prospect planning and a salesperson's inability to begin to better understand that actually once you slow down, you actually become much more creative in your thinking, and you can actually then begin to see where the best opportunities are to have those conversations. So if you planned well, you can be patient with the result. Outside of that, it comes down to intent. You need to know why you're making those calls you're making, and what what value you want to actually deliver to that person. And once you're clear on those particular things, you have more confidence then to have those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Nancy, your thoughts on this, and also there's a quick question here I'm going to throw into it as well for you. Number one, answering the question about being too me-centric, being too fast, and then somebody also asked, is it harder training younger salespeople nowadays coming in, given that they may have a different approach to things?
Well, that's I'm going to sidestep that for a moment and focus on this me-centric, because I actually have seen a lot of very experienced sales reps be extremely me-centric. So I don't think that that's necessarily an age thing. But, to build off of what Anne and Jermaine were saying, I think this, not being too me-centric starts with our mindset and then follows through in our actions. And so, if everything, and this is cultural, we have a lot of leaders on the call today. This is, what does your culture support? As Jermaine was saying, does it support get in, get out, make this many calls, just, here's what you got to say? Or does the culture support that preparation and that mindset of everything focused on what's in it for them? And when we work with sales teams and bring in the marketers and have everyone really identify, is everything we're putting out there, from our materials to our conversations to our follow-up process, focused on what's in it for them? Or is it focused on us, on our features, on the information we want to push? So to me, that's where it all begins, is the culture and the ability to have everybody on the same page, that everything we say and do has to be answering that question, what's in it for them? And if not, and I use a simple test, whatever you're going to put out there for information, put yourself in the mindset of a buyer and say, so what? So what? What does that mean for me? And if you can't answer what does it mean for your buyer, you're wasting your time and energy.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I agree with your point. It's not a generational thing particularly, because if you think there's a lot of salespeople out there, senior experienced salespeople who grew up in the era of where the salesperson had all the information and the buyer didn't, right? So there was a certain power attached to that, and you could, they could kind of control things a little more. As Anne said, we live the power has shifted to the buyer, informationally anyway, to the buyer. So, that's required a shift in behavior change on behalf of a lot of experienced salespeople. But just answering that other question, do you think there's a younger salespeople coming into the sales profession? Is there anything in particular that any challenges, or on the flip side, any positive traits that they bring?
Mm-hmm. You want me to start?
Yeah, if you could.
Okay. Well, two things that we've noticed is that the younger generation are actually learners. Like, they're used to learning. They're information junkies. So they want quick and fast answers to everything that they might want to know. And that everything we have found has to be more visual. We need a lot more visual ways to keep them engaged in our training than we did before. Yeah. And that it's funny, we do a lot of, we lay out frameworks and then we make them do the work to create their own 3-step start, to create the questions that they need to ask. We take them through processes, and they're a little more resistant to that. They want it more spoon-fed to them, where the more experienced people, age or just experience, they like to put their own thought process into it and figure it out more. So that instant gratification, from this slide, ties into learning as well. Things have to be really quick, smaller chunks, and they've got to have some direct applicability.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so we also like to get practical on these webinars. So maybe starting with you, Jermaine, can you give some examples of the best type of sales conversations you've had and how you managed to get it to that point?
Yeah, interesting enough. Gosh, when was the last one? Definitely probably a year ago, actually. I got a call from a colleague of mine in Germany, and he literally verbatim, he told me, I need you to call this potential client and convince him you're a great person to work with, so he can work with me on a very sensitive issue. And so I was like, well, okay, well, what's this about? As we began to explore it, we recognized that this was actually quite a big deal. And this client was about to make a decision on whether or not he should bring in my colleague and myself to help him save a $50 million account. And so ended up getting on this specific call and immediately recognizing that I was on the back foot. So this person was looking for ways to discount me as a person to work with. And so the immediate conversation for me was with the person is how can I today help you, so even if we work together or not, you feel better about moving forward.
Excellent.
And so that was kind of the beginning of that sales conversation. That's what kind of helped me kind of move that on.
Excellent. Anne, do you have some examples of some of your best sales conversations and how you managed to get there?
Well, I'm coming at this from a slightly different different angle, because the way I work is with business owners. So that small businesses, so the owners are doing everything in the business as well as being the salesperson. Right. And so there's two different things here. So when I'm selling my own services into them, it's all about understanding where they're coming from, all the pressures that they're under, all the things they're trying to do in their business. And very often what I'll do is talk to them about potential that they are missing, or that I can spot in their business where they could be improving it. So my sales conversations are about their sales conversations, and so, and sort of leading them into that. So my own clients come from those kinds of examples. But I'm also very privileged to be working with people when they're having those sales conversations to improve their business. So I can see when they really get it, you know, when they spot an opportunity that previously they may not have done, and I can match their steps along the way and see how they're having those conversations. So there isn't any specific thing, but it's just it's an organic thing that's happening all the time when I'm working with my clients.
Excellent. How about you, Nancy?
Well, I take a very systematic approach to conversations. There's a lot of flexibility in there for the person, situation, etc. But there's a beginning, a middle, an end, that I follow. And so a recent conversation, I got to the point that it was a referral, and I did a lot of research. Not a lot, actually, it was 20 minutes. It's not a lot of time. And our research shows that for every minute of preparation, you'll save 1.7 minutes of time in that sales opportunity. So it's a good payoff on time.
For sure.
But in going into the meeting, I could tell he was a very expressive person. People, very chatty. And so the owner of a company met me in the lobby. And before going to the room, I asked him a question about his building. And before you know it, he's taking me on a 35-minute tour of the building. And along the way, he's telling me a lot of the things that I would have asked him once we got into the conference room in a conversation. So it was easy then, once we got into the formal conversation, to build off of everything he had just said and showed me as I was exploring his problems, his opportunities, his wants and needs. And one of the interesting things is he was talking about everything being great. And I was the one that finally had to say, well, I'm confused. You wanted to talk to a sales growth consultant, yet you're happy with the people you have on board, your company is growing, you say you're profitable, and you see unlimited opportunity. Why are we having this conversation? And he immediately looked at me and said, because none of it's happening fast enough. So now I know what's important to him, and then we go from there, and we have our next meeting scheduled.
I thought he was just going to charge you for the tour of the building.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that you touched on, so maybe you can start the next answer is, you said you get to observe and, be part of the sales conversations that they have. So when you review them, how do you figure out if it was a success or not, and what kind of feedback do you give?
And that's a great question. So many people focus on what was the end result. Is it successful because of the end result? And that is important. But also, if we're training somebody or we're helping somebody develop, and even if they're in sales 30 years, people still can develop and get rid of bad habits. We have a systematic approach, and so we have a quick checklist that as we're sitting in on a sales conversation or listening to any recorded ones, we can say, did they accomplish this important part? Did they accomplish this? Did they accomplish that? And they also have the same checklist. So when we're doing a coaching feedback, we first ask them to dissect what went well, what would be different. And one of the things, and this is really important for any leaders on here, most people will focus on what they did wrong. And if that's all they're focusing on, what we're focusing on, what they're doing is trying to fix a lot of things, and they can lose sight of what they're doing well. And some of those natural things that if they're enhanced even 10% are going to get better results than if they move the things that they're doing terribly 50%. And so, when we're reviewing and giving feedback, it's continually reminding people on what they did well and how can they repeat that, as much as what's that one thing that you can do different next time.
Absolutely. And Anne, so when you sit down with the business owners and you review calls with them, sales conversations, how do you assess the success of them or the other?
Well, not as systematic as Nancy. It's a much more informal kind of process, but with exactly the same kind of feeling that she just expressed. I would agree 100% that what people focus on all the time is what they did wrong or what they might do better. And so it is a case of teasing out, what they thought went well and making sure they don't forget that the next time they go in. And so often that's a case of making notes, and then before the next time going through those notes and reminding them what they did well and the things that they wanted to do better. So it is kind of the same as Nancy, but not quite as formal.
Is there anything, Anne, is there anything that people often do well that they don't notice? I mean, that you have to actually say, but that's something that you actually did really well here.
Yeah, one of the big things, because a lot of the people I work with are actually selling themselves, they're providing a service. So, and they find that really difficult. They all say, if I could go and sell, a washing machine or a car or something, but I can't sell myself because it feels like bragging. Mm-hmm. So it's picking up on those things. It's saying, this is how you really explained what you do, rather than it's all about you. So it's explaining what you do for the customer and the benefit that you can bring to their business, rather than them feeling just that they're shooting off at the mouth and saying what a great guy they are.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Jermaine, how do you review a sales conversation and decide if it was successful or not?
Yeah, so I go back to my statement beforehand. I'm always looking for, and even with my clients as well, was the prospect better off because you were on the call with them? And so what we do is we look at the goal of the call. So I ask the question, typically, what value would you like to deliver for the other person on the phone? And we start from that perspective. So if the metric there is, I really want to be able to share some insight that helps them to think about something differently, then we have a look at, did they ask those questions? Or did they ask a better question? Or we look at some of the positive things that they've done in order to achieve that goal, amongst some other things. Is there kind of an 80-20 rule being applied there? So are they allowing the prospect to speak a little bit more than they are? Are they responding to the customer cues kind of positively, whether or not those customer cues are negative or positive? Did the prospect ask them questions? So we're looking at a range of different things there just to make them aware of what things could be on the call that they could be considering when coming off the call and then reviewing it again. But it's all a really kind of positive experience because we begin with the person in mind and we're looking at the metrics around how we deliver value to the other person.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had the privilege of working a bit with Neil Rackham when I was running Huthwaite. Neil Rackham, the author of Spin Selling, and what he used to say was, after a sales call or sales conversation, ask yourself, did you create enough value that the prospect or the person you're talking to would actually write you a check for the call, not for the service you're trying to sell or whatever, but for the actual call. And I used to, I always thought that was a good framework, but it's also, I thought, it's good, but it's, it's a little theoretical. But I went with him to a large global company, and we met with the executive management, and we spent about 2 hours in a call with them around some particular issues. And at the end of that meeting, I said to Neil, go on, ask for a check. This is what you believe. And so he did. He actually said to the CEO, he said, did you get enough value out of this meeting that if I was to invoice you just for the meeting, you would pay? And the CEO stopped for a minute, and then he said, yeah, actually I would. So, so yeah.
I love that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's, in the final few minutes, a couple of quick tips that maybe some of the listeners and the people who will listen and watch the recording, quick tips to better execute sales conversations. Maybe starting with you, Jermaine. What are some quick tips that you would give people?
Yeah, get clear on intent. So know why you're calling and making that call. I definitely consider, people just don't think about this, but prepare before you need to make the call. Don't start preparing 2 minutes before you need to make the call. So prepare way before you need to make those calls that are kind of a highest value to you. Make sure you're thinking about the 80-20, making it about them, but just practice. This won't come overnight. You won't just become perfect at these conversations. Just get comfortable with being uncomfortable and get started in practicing and making those conversations happen.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that phrase. Get comfortable being uncomfortable, because let's face it, you're going to be in a lot of uncomfortable conversations throughout your career. I love that. Um, how about you? And what are some tips that you would have for people?
I agree with Jermaine. Research, know who you're talking to, know what problems you might be able to solve for them. Um, really get into this business of what you have in common, so you establish rapport really quickly, and just get used to asking really good questions and listening hard to the answers. So letting the answers lead on to the next question.
Excellent. And how about you, Nancy?
It's a lot of the same. Prepare, boring but true, so that you don't ask for information you can get in advance and not waste your time with them.
Yeah.
Break your own preoccupation so that you can be present in the conversation, which is so important to be able to notice the subtleties of what that person needs from you as you're moving that conversation forward. And then what Ann said, if you ask a question, let them answer it. So you gotta, pause enough to let them answer it. And interesting research that, people don't do that. They, after 1 to 2 seconds, move on, answer it. And if you're asking good questions, people might need 15 seconds to think before they respond. So and then, strive to make it productive with clearly defined next steps, even if that next step is a no, and you know how to move on, and spend your time and energy somewhere else.
Yeah, that's great, because that actually tees off on a question that we had. But just going back to what you were saying about listening, one of the things, and again, this is a kind of a thing that's crept into our culture, is that we're very uncomfortable with silence, right? And particularly in a sales situation, uh, when you ask a question and the other person stops and there's silence for a moment, the natural inclination in a lot of people and a lot of us is to jump in and fill that space. But as you say, if you ask a really good question, well, let's face it, the person needs some time to think about their answer. And the answer you're going to get is going to be a lot more valuable if you let them sit in silence for a moment and think about the question.
Yeah,
I call it the pause time. The pause time. After you ask a question, pause. And whatever, pay attention to what you're doing now and double it, which it's hard to go from 2 to 4 seconds, but the payoff's going to be there.
Well, here's a quick question that we had, and it's just following on from something you mentioned. And maybe Anne, if you want to answer this, is how do you know if a conversation is not really going anywhere, and how do you get out of a conversation, elegantly, say?
I'd be really upfront about it. I'd really just say, look, I'm getting the feeling that this isn't going anywhere. Tell me if I'm wrong, or how do you feel about this? Where this is going? Are you getting what you want out of this conversation? I'm sure there are more skillful and probably more subtle ways of doing it, but I really feel, as Nancy says, if you are aware of your own feelings and the other person's feelings, once you get that going, you've got to confront it, and you've just got to break the situation. So, someone showed me something the other day. He's he's one of the world's best negotiators, and he said when they get into that situation where people are kind of just very uncomfortable, he'll knock over a glass of water or do something just to break the energy, and then start apologizing and mopping up and doing, and then sit down, take a deep breath and say, right, now where were we, and kind of start again. So there are ways of doing it, but I think a lot of it depends on your own personality and the person that you're with and how comfortable they are and all that kind of stuff that's going on.
Excellent. So I've actually, the times when I've knocked over glasses of water and things, I've actually been strategic, and I just thought I was being I remember that. Okay, that was completely different. Okay, well, we're nearly at the end here. So what I want to do is just give each of you an opportunity again to let the listeners know how they can contact you, and and for the people who are going to view this afterwards, because we get a lot of people who view the recordings. So maybe starting with Jermaine, how can people get in contact with you, Jermaine?
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place now, but yeah, Twitter at JSA Edwards, LinkedIn, Jermaine Edwards, and obviously JermaineEdwards.com as well. You can find a ton of great resources on becoming an irreplaceable advisor in the marketplace today.
Great. And how about you, Anne? How can people contact you?
Yeah, on Twitter, just my name, Anne Hawkins. There's no E on Anne. LinkedIn, Facebook, everything is just my name. Google Plus, everything. And my website is annehawkins.com.
Excellent. And Nancy?
All right, two things. We put together a page that will give some free resources to your listeners. SalesProInsider.com/pipeliner.
Oh, thank you.
And that will give them to everything. And then my book is called Conversations That Sell, and you can find that on Amazon, on our website. We actually have a conversationsthatsell.com that has a lot of the tools that I was mentioning about the framework. So.
Excellent. And you'll also find, we'll make sure that that book is in our bookstore on salespop.com as well, and salespop.pipelinersales.com. All right. Well, listen, I want to thank the three of you. This was a great conversation. And in fact, it threw up a number of subjects that probably could be their own conversations. We had great questions from the audience. I want to thank everybody who participated. This recording will be available probably tomorrow. So please go ahead and share with your colleagues and anybody else you think would be interested. So again, my name is John Golden from Pipeliner Sales and from SalesPOP Magazine. I want to thank Anne, Jermaine, and Nancy for a fascinating conversation. And we'll see you all again soon on another panel discussion. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you, John.
Okay. Bye now. Thank you.